this is Nina. Welcome to NV Fine Art Studio. Connecting things is not a very well-known technique, but is a very strong compositional trick that would help to create a fluid path for your eye to travel through your painting. First, I want to show you what I mean by visual connections, and then to show you how different a scene might look with and without these connections. There are two types of connections: via edges and via shapes. Connections via edges means losing or fading edges. You can lose edges by utilizing wet on wet or dry brush technique. Dry brush is an easy technique and self-explanatory, but I still want to quickly show you what I mean. First of all, you need cold or rough watercolor paper for this. Secondly, the paint mix has to be quite thick, similar to milk or cream consistency, and not too much of it on your brush. If you have too much paint on your brush, as I'm at the moment, when you shake it, it will drip, and when you make a mark, it will be a hard-edged mark. I'm going to remove the excess of water and add more paint, make the mixture thicker. Here's the good consistency for making a dry brush mark. It is very sticky to the surface of the palette. Then I do a quick brush mark, and here we have it, the dry brush mark is done. You can do dry brush for all sorts of things. For example, to paint fine branches on a winter tree without leaves. I say tree, but in reality I mean a strong vertical that connects the sky and earth by a dry brush mark. As I mentioned before, you can also lose edges by painting wet on wet. This is very common for painting shadows, distant objects, objects on a foggy or rainy day, or water reflection. Wet on wet technique is a bit more complicated than making a dry brush mark, especially if you are just starting with watercolors. You have to be familiar with stages of wetness of the paper and the mixture consistency. In other words, how much water versus paint you have on your brush. I don't want to talk about it too much in this tutorial, it's a topic on its own, but I have a video where I talk more about wet on wet and how to simplify it. The link is in the description below. Another way of making connections in your painting is via shapes. This is when you merge multiple shapes into one if they are in one value group. This is probably the hardest concept if you are a beginner to grasp, but nothing is unachievable if you practice often. If you want to practice, here's the pathway. The first step in the right direction would be to learn how to do a value study. I talked about it quite a bit in my previous videos. Here's the link if you are interested, so I'm going to skip this part. The next step is to practice flat single color and multicolor washes. And this is how you do it. Single color. You need to premix enough paint. If you run out of paint in the middle of your wash, you may risk getting a hard edge and it won't be a flat wash anymore. Then you fully load your brush. Don't poke the palette when you load, or you lose all the paint. You have to scoop it. Then go and do a few brush strokes. Don't wait while you fully run out of paint. Reload your brush often and make sure you always touch the bit. Make sure you always go above the area where you stopped before, and again until the shape is fully filled. Here's an example of what might happen if you have to mix colors on the go without premixing and leave your wash to wait for you for a minute or two. The edge gets drier, but the mix you're mixing is still very fluid. Firstly, you will get the unwanted hard edge in between the washes, and secondly, you may get cauliflower blooms. Multicolor flat wash. Again, you have to start with pre-mixing your puddles. Here we have green, red and yellow. I'll start with green. Scoop the paint. Do a few strokes. Reload my brush with yellow. touch the green, do a few strokes, reload the brush with red, touch the yellow bead, and do a few strokes with red. Here we have it, a multicolor flat wash. After you practiced flat washes, I'd recommend painting a simple composition using the same technique. And here's an example for you with a pear, apple and a banana. I prepare the puddles. Yellow for the banana, I'm using lemon yellow and a little bit of red to make it warm yellow. Honestly, it doesn't matter what color you can use all the colors of the rainbow. But for the sake of this tutorial, I'm going to stick to the original colors, so I'm going to use red for the apple and green for the pear. I'm starting with the apple. I'm fully loading the brush and filling the shape of the apple with as little brush strokes as possible. Then quickly, while the shape is still wet, I rinse the brush and reload with the green for the pear. I'm touching the red bead to achieve soft edge in between the shapes and continue with painting the pear. Constantly reminding myself to do as little brush strokes as possible. This is very important that these colors blend into each other on the paper. This is very important not to see a hard edge in between the apple and the pear. I'm doing similar technique with the banana. I'm touching the edge of the apple and the pear. If you want to complicate this a little bit, you can also add shadows wet into wet. So here's I'm doing flat multicolored wash once more. And very quickly, while it's still wet, I'm dropping in the shadows. And you can always vary the intensity of shadow, starting from a middle value, going to the darker value. This is the hardest stage of the painting, to find all the connections, but very important one, as the big connected shape will define the composition of your painting. Even when you put the darkest darks on top of the first wash, you still see the reminiscence of the beautiful lost edges, bounced lights and connections. I'm not the inventor of this technique, don't get me wrong. I learned it by meticulously studying the work of Alvaro Castaneda, Joseph Zbukevich, Andy Evanson, and many more. And they learned it from previous generations of artists such as Sargent, Chamberlain, Monet, Gruner, Seago. And I'm sure the list doesn't stop here. No one needs to invent the wheel. The most important part is to preserve the knowledge and pass it to the future generations. In a second, I'm going to show you two examples. One will be with connected shapes and the other one without. Please remember, I'm not here to say one is better than the other. I just want to share how visual connections can be used to unify the painting and help the viewer to travel through the painting effortlessly. In theory, there are no rules, and if there are rules, they are there to be broken. But if you struggle with making your painting loose, expressionistic and atmospheric, maybe this is the answer you've been looking for. And again, if you think you need more practice with this, I have Patreon where I show and explain everything I do. If you join Masterclass community tier, you will be able to join my private Facebook group, post your attempts and receive critique from me. Also chat to other members, see their attempts. One of my patrons actually said that it's very helpful to see attempts of others, and it's easier to see where you can improve. So please find me there if you feel like you are at a standstill. I'm sure I will be able to help. Okay, let's see these examples. This is the example with visual connections. Here's I'm painting the background wet on wet. The purpose is soft edges. On one hand, this is due to making the background out of focus and pushing it far away from us. On the other hand, it is a very good way of connecting the middle ground to the background. Here's the smudged edge, the dry brush mark between the red and white buildings. On one hand, it is to show the texture of the old house wall. On another, it is a connection between these two buildings. The bottom of the garage door has a rough edge. Quite often I see a perfect straight line with a hard edge at the bottom of the buildings. And this is one of the most important things to avoid. Remember, continuous hard-edged lines disconnect shapes. So either try to do a dry brush mark for the ground to have these little connections to the surroundings, or do rough or soft edges on the adjacent shapes to the ground. This is an example of a connection via shape. The shadow from the tree goes from the ground, connects to the tree on the left-hand side, goes through the building, connecting windows, roofs, etc., and finally to the tree above the roof. This is an example of the connection via shape and edges. I'm painting wet on wet house reflection. It will have soft edges and connect the foreground water to the boat. I'm also making a broken edge at the bottom of the boat to make sure not to break that connection of the water reflection. Here are some examples of the dry brush marks for the tree foliage that we talked about earlier in this tutorial. Great connection to the sky. Here's a little line that goes from the background to the foreground. This is an invented shadow that is not on the photograph, and I purely added this to the scene to have a visual connection. Otherwise, the shore, being a strong horizontal, works as a very strong divider. This is an example where I focused on not doing connections. The tree tops are painted as a solid line with milk-like consistency mixture. This is definitely something that you should try to avoid doing. It is narrow here, so you cannot really assess the damage, but if it was a half of the painting, it would look dry and dead. Horizontal strip of land. It is a strong horizontal that divides sky and earth, top and bottom. Not to have a connection there must have a strong, well-thought purpose. Two boats on the foreground, completely disconnected from anything else. They are a potential focus point, and having them disconnected equals making a roadblock at the entrance of the freeway. Connections apply not only to the darks but to the light values as well. Having a light object disconnected from the surroundings results in isolation as well. I couldn't resist myself and decided to add a few connective elements. Here I am adding people to the shore. They are dark objects and nothing more than connecting elements for the top and bottom part of the painting. This worked out well. Here I'm adding public lights to connect middle ground to the sky. They are too small to create the good connections and make a difference. So I'd suggest adding a hazy mountains or a few soft-edged high rises to the background, or just do a dry brush here and there for the trees. Here these two paintings are side by side. I exploit connecting elements in my paintings a lot, and my heart belongs to the sample with lost and found edges and connected elements. I find it to be a very powerful way to deliver a message. If you are an oil painter, you know how hard it is to achieve this soft and loose transition, but with watercolor it is a God-given technique. Watercolor consists of water and color, and most of the time water paints much better than a man. So at any given time I would give all the power to water to do its job and be just a bystander observing the magic happening in front of my eyes. If you've never done this, I'd suggest going small and simple. Paint a cow, a bowl of fruits, a flower. Most importantly, don't go all out and paint it straight away. Look at your subject. Think values, not colors. If it's the same value, lose the edge in between the objects. If you get an uneven wash, practice doing a flat single color and then multicolor wash. Do this for a couple of months, then slowly start complicating your subject. I know it might sound boring, but you won't believe how rewarding it feels when you get your first very simple subject painted beautifully. And obviously it doesn't have to be the only thing you paint. It can be just an exercise prior painting or just a 15-minute practice if you don't have time for anything else. Hope this was informative. If you want to see more, please hit that like button, subscribe and share. It will help my channel to grow and deliver you more great content. This is it for today. I will see you in my next video. Happy painting!